Some say New York is the safest big city in America. A decade ago, even 20 years ago, things were very different. Crime, especially violent crime, stalked the city streets. Much of the credit for the crime drop goes to the New York Police Department. Yet the nation's largest police force is also now facing its toughest slapdown in years. A federal judge has ordered the city to appoint an independent monitor to oversee changes in its stop-and-frisk practices. A new civilian inspector general will soon be installed at police headquarters to protect civil rights. Our current mayor, Mike Bloomberg, warns this is all a recipe for disaster, that we're threatening the very policies that have kept us safe. But it's up to the next mayor to decide whether he's right. Actually, it's up to us. Next month, New Yorkers will be choosing between candidates with visions about the future of the NYPD that couldn't be more different. Bill de Blasio promises to fulfill the court orders to the letter and appoint a new police commissioner to replace Ray Kelly. Joe Lhota says he'll fight tooth and nail to block the oversight plans. He'll keep Kelly if Kelly agrees to stay. But the differences go deeper than that. It's about what kind of policing we want in a modern democracy. At John Jay College, these questions are personal. Our 14,000 students represent the next generation of leaders in our criminal justice system. Some of the country's leading criminal justice scholars are on our faculty. So we've brought the debate to Criminal Justice Matters. Two John Jay professors, both in the top ranks of their fields, have joined us to discuss what we're calling the good, the bad, and the future of the NYPD. Dr. Dolores Jones-Brown teaches in the Department of Law and Police Science. She's the founding director of the college's Center on Race, Crime, and Justice and co-author of a groundbreaking study on NYPD's stop, question, and frisk policies. Recently, she launched a new interactive website, stop-and-frisk-info.org. Dr. Mackie Haberfeld is chair of the same department and specializes in police training and terrorism studies. She's a former lieutenant in the Israeli National Police. But before we go to them, I'd like to play a brief clip of interviews we did with a few of our students.
So on the top of the wish list, it would obviously be to have less unlawful stops, but we need to also look at what measures the NYPD is taking for safety. So we got to see where that balance is. So I think inside the NYPD, they need to address that. Are there any other ways to keep us safe? Is racial profiling the only way? Stopping people in inner city neighborhoods, is that the only way? I mean, if you look at statistics, not all cities that have been afflicted by crime have used stop and frisk.
Under a new mayor, I would definitely like to see more transparency with regards to the stop and frisk issues. I'm happy that the court was able to rule that there will be more transparency and that the NYPD should be able to report the number of stop and frisk cases that they encounter.
I do feel that with the stop and frisk, it should be kept. I think that definitely helped the city tremendously as far as crime rates. And I feel that, as far as the whole thing with racial profiling, I feel like that's just a defense mechanism. We all have it.
If the NYPD is going to have police officers patrolling communities, that they should be aware of the community that they are patrolling, and they should be more engaged in community affairs, community relations, so that, they don't jump to conclusion when something happened, and they don't, discriminate or stereotype.
I live in the, in the lower income. That's all I see. All the time, all I see is supervision of the police. And when I go downtown, I don't see that many police officers there. You're trying to say that we need supervision because we don't know how to behave?
I think the mayor should work with all the groups, bringing all ethnic groups, those, especially those that have been targeted in the past as being potential terrorist sources. He should aim at, dissipating the tension by being inclusive and not divisive.
Keep the focus on the anti-crime unit, anti-terror unit, and just do what they do best, which is protect the city.
So, welcome to both of you.
Thank you for having us.
So let's get some of your initial thoughts about what you've just heard. Professor Brown, let's start with you.
I think that the student views about stop and frisk were very interesting, and it was interesting the way in which the racial identity or apparent ethnic identity of students tended to govern whether they thought stop and frisk was a good thing or a bad thing. And of course, that then means that the way the practice itself is playing out in the city is reflected in the attitudes of the young people. Which line of rhetoric, and I'm going to use that term, one agrees with, tends to be governed by their racial and ethnic identity, which should be problematic in a diverse city like New York City, in a country that is as diverse as the United States, and where we adhere to notions of liberty and justice for all.
Dr. Haberfield, your thoughts initially? First take.
Yes. You know, I always look at policing in the 21st century in democratic countries as kind of Mark Twain saying these are the best times and these are the worst times. On one hand, these are the best times because police departments receive more training, police departments receive people with credentials that they didn't receive before, they recruit people with credentials. Technology helps police officers determine where to go and what to do. But on the other hand, there is a lot of transparency, a lot of accountability, and there's nothing wrong with this, except for the fact that everybody seems to have a very informed opinion as to how policing should be done. Policing is a profession, and a profession that already is based on quite a lot of empirical research, quite a lot of experience out there in the field that goes back, you know, the experience goes back hundreds of years. And it bothers me that people speak with a lot of confidence about how policing should be done. I think it's very important to address perceptions of people who are the recipients of police work. But at the same time, I think it's very important for these people who have these perceptions and opinions to understand that these are individual opinions.
Well, the students clearly had some very definitive ideas about what they
Too
thought.
definitive, I would say.
Too definitive.
Too
That's
definitive.
interesting. As Dolores points out, where you stand often depends on where you sit and where you come from ethnically. Sure. But let me start off the questioning maybe by asking if we had Mayor Bloomberg, if we had the NYPD in one of your classrooms, what kind of grade would you give them over the last 12 years? We've had a 12-year run with the same police commissioner, Ray Kelly, and with the same mayor. We've seen a remarkable drop of crime.
Yeah. Well, the way I grade students depends on many different aspects of their work. So, you know, if you are asking me about the overall grade of policing in New York City over the last 12 years, I would probably be somewhere between 7 and 8.
That's pretty high.
Pretty high. Pretty high.
Dolores, I don't imagine you'd be rating them as high. You're a tough grader.
I would actually give them about a C+ in terms of what we've been able to establish, they've been able to accomplish regarding crime control, but the lower part of that grade is based on their interaction with the community. I disagree with Maki. Policing is not that kind of profession that the folks at the top get to have a top-heavy approach to policing. Policing is a public service job, and the people in the United Kingdom have recently begun to talk about the notion of policing by consent. And the notion that policing by consent should be the motto has gotten lost in New York City.
Well, that brings up the question how you measure effectiveness of police. And we have data, and the data suggests that crime has dropped amazingly, double the rate that we've seen in other cities around the U.S. So that suggests that Ray Kelly, if we're talking about the good, the bad, and the future of the NYPD, if we start with the good, that's pretty good for all of us,
well,
isn't it?
First
Regardless
of
who we are.
No, so first of all, there is a problem because San Diego has had a more substantial and long-term drop in crime without using aggressive stop and frisk and other kinds of aggressive policing tactics. So there is a question of the accuracy. I think because New York City is larger in terms of its police department, its reputation is bigger in terms of where it is. And the economic divide in New York City is so much wider than any place else in the country. we tend to attribute things to the police department that don't necessarily belong there. So, for example, criminologists have for years known that multiple factors affect crime. Policing would be only a very minuscule part of any crime decline. So the economists have said for the last 15, 20 years that changes in the economy are responsible for the decline in crime we see in New York City and around the world.
Changes in the economy in what sense?
There were economic improvements up until 2008, and even then, with the drop in the economic situation for those of us at the middle class and above in 2008, the folks below us didn't experience those changes in the economy as desperately or drastically as those of us in the middle class and those above the middle class.
Well, certainly there's some evidence that the drop in crime is a bit scattered. I mean, there are areas now where crime indeed seems to be increasing in some areas.
Well, if I could finish the point about the other factors, so the demographics, so the age of young people, which most crime tends to center around us, those of who are going to be involved in crime tend to be younger. The number of young people around the country and in the world has decreased. And so that also has been attributed to the decline. So there are ways in which we've made this focus on policing so adamant that the other empiricists outside of policing don't at all agree with.
But a minuscule impact on crime decline, as Dolores says, what would you think, Mackie?
Well, first of all, I don't like to talk about police influence on crime because it's a very amorphous term. There are different types of crime. So I would agree that there is a certain minuscule influence of policing on white-collar crime, for example. This is not something that any police force can influence in any significant way. But when we talk about street crime, when we talk about violent crime, there is a significant impact on that police can attribute to the way they deploy their forces. Not necessarily elimination of crime per se, but certainly crime displacement. So somebody who was hoping to commit a crime on the streets of New York can suddenly go, let's say, to New Jersey because there is saturation of patrol presence in a given neighborhood. So talking about violent crime, talking about street crime, I would say that there is an impact that is not minuscule at all of any police force, including NYPD here.
I mean, whatever happens, there's certainly going to be changes in the years ahead with the new mayor. Whoever wins, we're going to see a whole new concept of policing. Even Mr. Loda, I think, is not going to absolutely blanketly continue the same policies. But we're facing two certainly very important changes in the way we police the city. One is the existence of an independent civilian monitor plus a court-appointed monitor. Both of them imposed because of questions and rulings on and judgments, really, that our stop-and-frisk policies have unfairly targeted Black and Latino citizens of this city. Let me start with you, Mackie. Do you see these proposed changes as, like Bloomberg, as devastating impact on the city? Is that going to make us less safe?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily, because I think that the way the city is policed, it's only partially can be attributed to the politics behind policing, but it's also, on the other hand, part of the actual way that individual police officers, precincts, borough commanders police the city. So you have sort of an amalgamation of politics and actual policing on the street. So you're not going to see a drastic and dramatic change. Of course, whenever there is a need or a demand to produce numbers, and this is part of the problem in policing in general, and Dolores was talking about policing by consent. Of course, I'm very much in favor of policing by consent, but at the same time, we have to stop demanding accountability from police organizations that is tied to numbers. That police organization is suddenly, it's not suddenly, but it's the trend of over 20 years now, police organization is treated as a corporate organization. You have to produce numbers.
Politics of policing.
Politics of policing.
One of the students mentioned, as you saw in our clips, he was hoping for more transparency. And Dolores, I imagine that you're quite happy with the way things are going. And under Bill de Blasio, those changes that are going to be imposed by the court, you would say would be net improvements in policing work over in the next little while.
Absolutely. I think one of the telling features of the Floyd case that was decided by Judge Shinlin is that there were police officers and former police officers who testified against the city, saying that, as Mikey pointed out, the demand for numbers, for a quota, which is an illegal activity for the government to engage in, that was part of what was driving the aggressive use and stop and frisk. So the fact that police officers were willing to say, this is not something that we wanted to do, but this is what we were told to do as part of our successful or professional job as a police officer, that was something that wasn't transparent, because each time there was an allegation that quotas were being demanded by the department, the commissioner would deny that that activity was taking place. The other thing that is really important to remember about stop and frisk, it would have never gotten to the level of controversy that it gained if roughly 90% of the people who were being stopped were not completely innocent of crime. Stop and frisk would be seen as an effective tool if somewhere above 50% of the people who were being stopped were in fact detected to have had crime. When stop and frisk became a technique for deterrence as opposed to detection of crime, that's where stop and frisk got into trouble. And when it did such an abysmal job of detecting crime, that's where it really got into trouble. And so at some point, the commissioner should have backed away from the way it was being done. And quite frankly, to his credit, in the last year and a half leading up to the trial, he did say, okay, we've got to bring our officers in and retrain them. It was one of those too much, too little, too late.
Okay, final assessment. Is it time for Ray Kelly to go? Is it time to get a new policeman? Very quickly from each of you. Maggie?
Well, I would stay away from attributing the way policing is done in New York City to one individual, especially as we all know that Commissioner Kelly, as any other commissioner or police chief in this country, around the world for that matter, is heavily influenced by the politician.
Dolores?
I would say yes, and the reason why I say yes is both the mayor and the commissioner apparently stayed too long and became too powerful, and therefore became resistant to the idea that they were in fact acting as public servants, and they began to be the father of the city, of the fathers, the great fathers of the city. And so as much as people asked for a change, at some point they dug in their heels and said, we know what's best for you, and so we're not going to change. And that wasn't always the position that the commissioner took. And I was quite disappointed in the last couple of years how forcefully both the mayor and the commissioner resisted the requests that came from the various members of the city to change the practice. The judge seized on that, and she said that they acted with deliberate indifference to the complaints that were being made by their constituents. And so unfortunately, they have lost their credibility. The mayor is out because his term is up, but the commissioner, I think, is not in a good position now to be an effective leader.
Okay, let's see what happens. Thanks to both of you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
The South Asian community is one of the fastest growing as well as the most vibrant of New York's rich potpourri of ethnic groups. But in the aftermath of 9/11, it has had a troubled relationship with the NYPD. Monami Maulik is founder and director of Daisy's Rising Up and Moving, commonly known as DRUM, created in 2000 to defend the rights of South Asian workers and young people. We're honored to add her perspective to this conversation. Monami, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
A few weeks ago, Ray Kelly complained that none of the candidates for mayor in New York had bothered to ask him for a terrorism briefing, and he thought that was outrageous. Does that suggest that the public safety concerns that we've had for the last 12 or 13 years are now a question of the past, or is it something that really should be on the minds of people as we think of the next police commissioner, the next mayor?
I think it's interesting that this is the shift has gone to local policing during the next mayoral elections. I think one of the reasons, frankly, is that perhaps it's an issue that there's not a lot of trust in the way that Ray Kelly has ran the police force, and in terms of the scrutiny it's gotten, even in terms of national security policy, that has really come under a lot of public scrutiny with the Associated Press reports, and even sort of, all kinds of questions about the practices that have been happening.
These are about the use of informants, right, in the Muslim
community.
Right,
the whole-scale surveillance of Muslim communities in New York in a 100-mile radius of New York City. These are real questions about whether these practices have actually been effective.
Well, the South Asian community, as we've said, has been on the firing line. Has been
That's right.
Particularly since 2011. What's been the impact? I mean, have people generally felt, well, this is not our police force, they're against us, and why bother to worry about it?
I think it's an issue of feeling like we are wholesale under scrutiny and watch. We work with thousands of South Asian immigrants in the city, women, men, children who are workers in the city. Our members are largely people who are taxi drivers and work in restaurants and do construction work, work in stores. They're average day-to-day New Yorkers. But in a 12-year span where we've seen thousands of people in our community being picked off the streets from places of work simply because their name was Khan, which is equivalent to John Smith, and they're a certain religion and nationality, and be deported, and often for the large majority, over 99%, for no reason at all, there is an issue of distrust and fear, and it's something that we really have to change in terms of the blanket racial profiling policies.
But yet, to play devil's advocate, most of the threats, as far as we can tell, come from that section of the community where we've seen those threats before, from 9/11 onwards. And if you talk to Ray Kelly, we've successfully stopped at least 10, maybe more, potential terrorist attacks against us from that community. So is there a point to be made here that perhaps not racial profiling, but that there has to be a way to assure the security of all of us by going after where those threats are likely to come from?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there should be effective policing. However, does effective mean blanket wholesale surveillance on 1 million plus people? Does it mean surveillance in places of worship, in schools, in community organizations? Our own organization was found out to have informants sitting in our meetings in one of the AP reports. That means, in effect, you're silencing the civic participation of an entire population, and that turns out being counterproductive.
Are South Asians better represented on the police force itself?
In recent years, there have been more, but again, there is a level of distrust because most of our community members find the police come to them when they want them to be informants, and it often ends up being a very coercive relationship of convincing somebody to snitch or give them some information.
So if you're sitting across from the next mayor, what would you tell him about the policing issues that need to be addressed and what he can do to solve them?
I would tell him that we need to build trust in communities, we need to build true relationships, and I think the recent Community Safety Act is going to go a long way towards mending some of the glaring issues of non-transparency and unaccountability. And I think that needed to happen. And the next step is to then build a bridge to work with community organizations and leaders and to really establish community policing, community-level civic participation that's going to change the city and make the city a better place.
The Community Safety Act is what calls for an independent prosecutor. Most of the pro-police forces here, the pro-Kelly forces, say that's going to destroy the police force and prevent it from actually operating to the safety of the rest of us. You think that's not going to happen?
I don't think so. And there's a lot of research that's been done, studies across the city and nationally that shows that this could really serve to make policing stronger and be a model for doing policing that's also accountable, transparent to the public, and then encourages the community to be a part of keeping our city safe, whatever that means in various senses, rather than feeling in opposition or attacked.
But we're a safer city now than we were 10 or 12 years ago, and safer for the South Asian community as well. Would you agree?
In some sense, but then you would talk to a lot of our community members who say they don't feel safer when they're under surveillance 24/7, and even a lot of the cases that Ray Kelly has put forward as we've caught the terrorists, frankly, there's been a lot of research and a lot of media reports that many of those were coerced cases of entrapment. There's a lot of studies done by NYU, various law schools, and we work with several families who've been the victim of entrapment cases with NYPD informants who were often, in some cases, paid $100,000 to submit data, whatever they could, and sort of really conjure up and submit cases. A lot of the people in our community who are being affected by these entrapments are vulnerable young men. In our case, it's a 19-year-old young man who's mentally disabled. And if you look deeper into many of these cases, they're often young men in the same situations, mentally challenged, have a chemical dependency issue, are desperately in need of money. And so the informant issue and the surveillance issue is one that we really need to tackle.
Are there things that you think the police force has done right, the good of the police force, not just the bad?
I mean, I believe that there are many, many individuals in the police force who really care about making the city a better place. And I do think that, there have been forces in the police and the NYPD who are supportive of the legislation that was recently passed. And, whatever Ray Kelly says, the police department is big and it has a lot of different folks within it that I think are happy to not have such an adversarial position in the city anymore.
That's great. Monabi, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
We can't know what public safety challenges will face the next mayor, but your choice will determine how he'll meet them. It's a responsibility that each of us should take seriously. I'm Steve Handelman. See you next time, and please remember to vote.